Hi, this is Albert from AWB Electrical and Marine Services. Just doing a little bit of a video on a little bit of a problem with some alternators. This is probably more so unique to, I guess, say newer generation motors. So these are a couple of Series 60s. With electronic unit injectors, so they're not full mechanical, they're like a partial mechanical setup. And these are Delco Remy alternators, they're 34 SIs. And this has actually had a repower. This had a repower in about 2005, this boat. And the funny thing is, on both alternators they had wires loose. That's just pulled off loose for me, just testing in that. But they've had these corrugated looms here loose here. One of these wires here is an ignition trigger, which goes on to this guy here with the eye. Obviously you got your positive, you got your relay, which we don't need to bother with that, and some will have a sense terminal up here, which would normally be like right about here where there's normally a hole there, if you could just look there. But yeah, so when I did some fault finding with these, and so the main problem with these, they just had poor voltage control on them. So the voltage wasn't really doing what it should have been doing. Initially they weren't charging because what happened was the boat was actually originally deceased estate and the previous owner didn't look after it, and there was a short out on the alternator here. The boat sat for a couple of years, and somehow in that process between the short out and the sit down, the alternators lost their magnetism, so they had to be respiked. So that was basically just flashing power from here to the ignition. The ignition terminal. Like you just flash it, and that just puts the magnetism back into the coil. And then when they started going, they were basically just wouldn't maintain voltage properly. So I put this ignition wire back on, and the voltage control went beautiful, and they turned on really straight away. So you didn't have to basically rev them up to self-excite, and it was all high fives around. Then went to turn off the engine, and the engine wouldn't turn off. So basically what that was telling me straight away, so the way I had to turn it off is I had to turn off the main isolator off the engine to cut the power feed. What basically happens is, on these alternators, it ends up getting a residual current feedback through the ignition circuit, then it feeds through, and because these engines use a very small amount of power, it maintains power to the ECU, and the ECU just keeps running and running and running and running. So you need to break that. So funnily enough, in the car I had a couple of these diodes. So obviously they're pointing towards, so it supplies voltage back, and any feedback it just blocks. So this is not a very common fault that happens. It's more so on engines with electronics. So purely mechanical engines, you wouldn't get it. Like carbureted engines, you very rarely would get it even with electronic distributors. But mainly ECU style setups. So like your newer Cummins QSMs, these Detroit Series 60s, even potentially I guess you could say the Series 2000s could potentially have it. But I would say most likely what's happened with this is with the patch limb that comes with these engines, the installers didn't know what didn't really understand that, and they just left the wires off, because the alternators do self-excite without the ignition. But what it means is you've got to rev them up so it can make its own field, then self-excite, then self-regulate. If you put the ignition terminal on, it basically gets a trigger straight away, and it virtually turns on initial idle. So pretty much virtually instantly. So yeah, so if anyone has a problem where the engine doesn't turn off when they've done some modifications to the alternator, easiest way to tell is either cut this wire or cut the battery feed. If that stops it, well, sorry, not the battery feed, you got to cut the power, but yeah, if you cut this wire here and it stops, you know straight away that it's got a residual current back feed through here, it's feeding electronics. And then the fix is just to put a diode in there. It doesn't have to be any massive diode. These are massively overkill. These are 1000 volt diodes, 4 amp diodes, I believe that. No, 6 amp diodes actually. This is for actually another job. This was actually to put inside an alternator to tweak a factory alternator to get the voltage higher on it. So yeah, if anyone wants to put a post up about, put a question about that, I can explain how to do that as well. Okay, so have a good one.